Stay with this story until the very end, because the secret hidden inside that old Rolex was about to cost Brennan Hale everything he thought he knew about himself. Joel Adler walked into Hale & Sons, fine timepieces on a Thursday morning in late October, when the first real frost of the season had settled over the streets of Hamilton, Ontario, and the city smelled like cold concrete and wood smoke. He was wearing a canvas work jacket with paint on the cuffs and a pair of boots that had been resoled at least twice. His daughter, Sophie, was 6 years old and holding his hand, and she was wearing a yellow raincoat, even though it wasn't raining, because she had chosen it herself that morning, and Joel had learned a long time ago that some battles were not worth fighting. Joel wasn't there to browse. He was there because 3 weeks earlier, he had pulled a cardboard box out of the crawlspace above his garage, a box that had belonged to his late wife Catherine, and inside it, wrapped in a wool sock, was a wristwatch. Old, dirty, the crystal scratched so badly you could barely read the dial. He had no idea where Catherine had gotten it. She had never mentioned it. But Catherine had been the kind of woman who kept quiet about things she thought might embarrass people, and Joel had long since learned to trust her instincts even when she was no longer there to explain them. He had cleaned the outside of the watch carefully with a soft cloth, the way he cleaned engine parts, slowly, methodically, without rushing, and what he saw underneath the grime had made him sit down on the cold concrete floor of his garage for a long moment. The case looked like gold. The dial, once he could see it clearly, had a depth and a color that he had never seen on a watch before. And on the back, engraved in letters so small he had needed his reading glasses, were 2 initials and a date he couldn't quite make out. He wasn't an expert. He was a diesel mechanic who had spent 22 years fixing heavy equipment for a construction company outside Burlington. He knew torque and tension, and the particular sound an engine makes when a bearing is about to fail. He did not know watches, but he knew quality when he held it, the way you can feel the difference between a bolt machined to tolerance and one that was stamped out in a hurry. And this watch felt like something that had been made by someone who cared very much about what they were doing. Sophie had been the one who suggested they take it to a shop. She had seen a place on King Street once, when they were driving past, with a window full of watches on velvet cushions. She remembered everything, that child. Joel sometimes thought she had inherited Catherine's memory, the same way she had inherited Catherine's brown eyes, and Catherine's particular way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. So on that Thursday morning, he pushed open the glass door of Hale & Sons, and a small bell rang above his head, and Brennan Hale looked up from behind the counter. Brennan Hale was the 3rd generation of his family to run the shop. His grandfather had opened it in 1961, his father had expanded it in the 80s, and Brennan had spent the last 15 years turning it into something that catered to a very specific kind of customer, the kind who drove a car with heated seats and didn't blink at a $4,000 service fee. He was not unkind, exactly, but he had developed, over the years, a very efficient way of reading people the moment they walked through his door, and what he read when he looked at Joel Adler was a man who was in the wrong place. He took in the jacket, the boots, the little girl in the yellow raincoat who was pressing her nose against the display case and leaving a small fog print on the glass. "Can I help you?" Brennan Hale said, and it was not quite a question. Joel set the watch on the counter. He had wrapped it in a clean cloth, the kind he used for lenses and instruments, and he unfolded it carefully. Brennan Hale looked at it. He reached out and turned it over once, without picking it up, the way you might turn over a rock on a path to see what was underneath. "Vintage piece?" Joel said. "Hard to say." Brennan Hale straightened up. "The case is worn, crystals shot. You can see the movement's been sitting for a while, probably decades. Without opening it up, I can't tell you much, but aesthetically speaking, it's not in great shape." "I understand that," Joel said. "I'm asking what it is, the maker, whether it has any value." Brennan Hale glanced at him, then back at the watch. He picked it up now, held it closer to the light. "It's old," he said, Might be Swiss. The dial design is consistent with mid-century work, but there are a lot of fakes from that period, without a full authentication. And that's not cheap, you're really just guessing. He set it back down. Honestly, a piece in this condition, even if it is what it looks like, you're not looking at much. Parts watches go for next to nothing, and restoration on something like this, if it's even restorable, would cost more than it's worth. Sophie had come to stand beside her father. She was looking at the watch on the counter with the same focused attention she gave to everything she found interesting. "It's pretty," she said quietly. Brennan Hale did not look at her. "I'll give you $200 for it," he said, "as is." That's fair given the condition. Joel looked at the watch. He thought about the wool sock. He thought about Catherine. He thought about the way this man had not once asked where the watch came from, or whether Joel had any papers with it, or what those initials on the caseback might stand for. "No," he said. He folded the cloth back around the watch and picked it up. "Thank you for your time." Brennan Hale shrugged in a way that managed to convey that he had expected exactly this, and that he found it faintly tedious. "Up to you," he said. "But if you change your mind, that offer won't last. Pieces like that, if someone doesn't want them, they just sit." Joel took Sophie's hand and walked back out into the October cold. He sat in his truck for a few minutes without starting the engine. Sophie was in the back seat drawing something in a small notebook she carried everywhere. Outside, the street was doing what Hamilton streets do in the fall, going gray and quiet, people moving fast with their heads down. He was not angry. Or he was, but it was the kind of anger that sits low and steady rather than flaring, the kind he had learned to work with rather than against. He had felt it before, many times, at job sites where foremen talked over him, in meetings where engineers with clean shirts dismissed things he said about tolerances and load limits, only to come back 2 weeks later having discovered he was right. He had learned that the best response to being dismissed was not to argue but to be correct. He drove home. That evening, after Sophie was in bed and the house was quiet, Joel sat at the kitchen table with the watch in front of him and his laptop open beside it. He had been a methodical man his entire life. He approached the internet the same way he approached a broken engine, starting with what he could observe, working inward. The dial color, the font on the numerals, the shape of the hands, the style of the crown. He searched for 3 hours. He followed threads on horological forums that were dense with jargon he had to look up. He cross-referenced. He compared photographs. And somewhere around 11:30, he found a thread on a watch collector's forum that had been posted 8 years earlier, with a photograph that stopped him cold. The watch in the photograph was not identical to his, but it was close enough that his chest went tight. The thread was about a series of watches made by a Geneva atelier in the late 1950s, a small workshop that had only operated for 11 years before closing, whose pieces had become, in the decades since, some of the most sought-after items among serious collectors. The atelier had produced fewer than 200 watches in total. Most were in private collections. A small number had been auctioned over the years for prices that Joel had to read twice. The highest sale, according to the thread, had been 4 years ago, $1.2 million. Joel read that number several times. Then he turned the watch over and looked at the caseback again. With his reading glasses and the good lamp from his workbench, he could finally make out what was engraved there. 2 initials, PV, 1961. He did not sleep well that night. The next morning he called in a favor from a man named Ted Kowalski, who had retired from watchmaking after 40 years and now lived outside Dundas and kept bees, and was famously difficult to reach by phone. Joel had fixed Ted's tractor 3 winters ago and refused to take money for it, which meant Ted owed him something, and Ted was the kind of man who took debts seriously. Ted called back the same afternoon. Joel drove out to Dundas with the watch wrapped in the cloth. Ted's property was at the end of a gravel road and smelled like wood smoke and clover. Ted met him at the door, and they went inside, and Ted took the watch to a workbench in a back room that was lit like an operating theater and very, very still. Ted said nothing for 20 minutes. Joel sat on a stool and waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the things that made him good at his job. Finally, Ted set down his loop and turned around. "Where did you get this?" Ted said. "My late wife had it," Joel said. "In a box in our crawlspace." Ted looked at him for a moment. "Your wife knew what this was." "I don't know what she knew." Ted was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "The movement is signed. The caseback inscription is consistent with documented provenance from the atelier. The serial number," he paused. "I'd need to check against the registry." "But Joel," he stopped. "This is the real thing." Joel drove home in the November dark thinking about Catherine. She had grown up in Montreal, the daughter of a watchmaker. Her father, a quiet man named Pierre, had emigrated from Switzerland in the late 50s. He had died when Catherine was in her 20s, before Joel ever met her. Catherine had inherited almost nothing. There had been debts, a small apartment, boxes of tools. She had never talked much about those years. Joel thought about the initials on the caseback. P.V., Pierre Vachon, Catherine's father. He thought about the wool sock. He sat in his driveway for a long time after he turned off the engine. Sophie knocked on the truck window from outside. She had come to find him. She was wearing her yellow raincoat again, over her pajamas, which was exactly the kind of thing Catherine would have done. "Dad," she said, "supper's getting cold. I made the pasta." She was 6 years old and had made pasta from a box and was standing in the driveway in her pajamas in November. Joel got out of the truck and hugged her for a moment longer than she expected. "What's that for?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Thank you for making supper." What happened over the next 4 weeks was the kind of work Joel understood, slow, careful, methodical. He contacted the watch registry Ted had mentioned, which was maintained by a horological foundation in Geneva. He sent photographs and the serial number. He gathered what documentation he could about Catherine's father. Immigration records, the small obituary that had appeared in a Montreal community paper, a photograph of Pierre Cahn's workshop that Catherine's aunt, now in her 80s and living in Laval, found in an old album and emailed to him as a blurry scan. He was not hasty. He was not excitable. He worked evenings after Sophie was in bed, the same hours he used to spend studying for the certifications he had taken over the years. Heavy equipment, pressure systems, electrical diagnostics. He knew how to move through difficult technical processes without rushing. The foundation in Geneva wrote back in 2 weeks. They confirmed the serial number against their records. The watch was one of 47 pieces made by the atelier between 1958 and 1962, of which only 19 were currently documented. It had been commissioned, according to their records, as a presentation piece. The original recipient's initials, P.V., matched the caseback engraving. Joel read the email 3 times, then made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the watch for a while. Then he called a woman named Sandra Okafor, who was a partner at an auction house in Toronto that he had found after careful research. Not the flashiest, but the one with the most documented sales in vintage horology over the past decade. He had read their catalogs. He had looked at their results. He had made a list of questions before he called. Sandra Okafor answered on the second ring and spoke with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been doing exactly this for 20 years. She listened to what Joel told her, asked 3 very specific questions, and then went quiet for a moment. "Can you bring it in?" she said. He brought it in the following Tuesday. He brought Sophie too, because it was a PA day and he had nobody to leave her with, and Sandra Okafor, it turned out, kept a jar of wrapped candies on her desk and had the manner of someone who found children completely reasonable. The authentication process took 10 days. Joel went back to work. He fixed a loader that had thrown a track on a site outside Ancaster, and a concrete pump with a hydraulic issue, and a generator that had been improperly stored over the summer. He did his job. He made Sophie's lunches and drove her to school and attended her winter concert, where she played a recorder solo that was technically imperfect and completely earnest. and he stood in the school gymnasium and felt the specific ache of raising a child alone, the fullness of it and the weight of it, both at once. Sandra Okafor called on a Friday afternoon. "The authentication is complete," she said. "We've had it reviewed by 2 independent specialists. The consensus is unambiguous." She paused. "Joel, we'd like to include this in our spring catalog. Pre-sale estimate, conservatively, is between $800,000 and $1.2 million. But given the provenance, the documented connection to the original atelier, and the confirmation of the recipient, we think there's a case for significantly higher." Joel was sitting in his truck in the parking lot of Sophie's school, waiting for the bell. He looked at the school building for a moment. "Thank you, Sandra," he said. "Do you have any questions?" He had 17 questions, which he had written in a small notebook. They went through all of them. The auction was held on a Thursday evening in April in Toronto, in a room that was not as large as Joel had imagined, but was very quiet in a way that felt intentional, the way the inside of a good engine is quiet when everything is working correctly. Joel wore a jacket that he had bought specifically for the occasion, at Sophie's insistence. She had come with him, in a blue dress she had chosen herself, and was sitting beside him, with her hands folded in her lap, watching everything with the focused attention she gave to things she found important. The bidding opened at $600,000. It moved in increments that Joel tracked carefully, the way he tracked pressure gauges. At $900,000 it slowed. Then a phone bidder entered, and it climbed again, and kept climbing. The hammer came down at $1.8 million. Sophie turned to look at him. She did not say anything, which was unusual for her. She just looked at him, and her expression was one he had seen on her face only a few times before. The same expression she had worn the morning after Catherine died, when she had come downstairs and found him sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. And instead of asking questions, she had simply climbed into his lap and stayed there. He put his arm around her. "Is that good?" she whispered. "Yes," he said. "That's very good." It was 2 weeks after the auction, on a Saturday morning, that Joel drove back past Hale & Sons on King Street. He wasn't going there. He was taking Sophie to her skating lesson at the rink 3 blocks further on, and it was just the route he always took. But as they passed the shop window, the velvet cushions, the watches under the glass, the gold lettering on the door, Sophie turned her head and looked at it. "That's the place," she said. "Yes," Joel said. "The man who said your watch wasn't worth anything, he did say that." Sophie considered this for a moment with the gravity she brought to things that seemed unjust to her. "Does he know now?" she said. Joel thought about that. He had not contacted Brennan Hale. He had not felt the need to. The auction had been covered briefly by a trade publication, and the result had appeared in a handful of horological newsletters. But it was not the kind of news that made the front page of anything. "Probably not," Joel said. "Are you going to tell him?" "No," Joel said. Sophie thought about this. "Good," she said, in a tone that sounded remarkably like Catherine. Joel parked the car near the rink and helped Sophie with her skate bag. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of February morning in southern Ontario that is almost aggressively beautiful. The sky a hard, particular blue, the snow on the sidewalks still clean from the night before. He thought about Pierre Vachon, who had carried a watch across the ocean and kept it his whole life, who had raised a daughter in a language that was not his first, who had died without knowing that the thing he had been given, this small, precise, extraordinarily made object, would one day sit in a room in Toronto while people in other countries bid for the right to own it. He thought about Catherine, who had wrapped it in a wool sock and put it in a box in a crawl space. He did not think she had done this carelessly. He thought she had done it the way she did most things, quietly, without explanation, trusting that the right moment would come. He thought about the morning she was diagnosed, and the way she had looked at him across the kitchen table, and what she had said, which he had not forgotten. "Just keep going. That's all. Just keep going." Sophie was already ahead of him on the path to the rink entrance, her skate bag bouncing on her shoulder, her breath making small clouds in the February air. She turned back once to see if he was following, and he was. He was always following. That was the job.